what I did on my summer vacation. Normally we go away, August, take a little family vacation, and circumstances were we just couldn't make that happen this year. I've got a daughter who's newly off to college, another one who's into summer theater. So I had the opportunity to do my own project, and I decided to paint my house. I don't know what I was thinking, but that's what I decided to do. Why did I want to do this? For a couple of reasons. Number one, to save money, the financial reasons. I want to improve the value of my house. I wanted to save some money and go in to do this. I wanted to reduce risk. I wanted to keep the water and the moisture out of the house. I wanted to keep the bugs out of the house. I wanted to reduce my infrastructure costs. I wanted to use less power, less electricity. So in the course of doing this, and the other reason I wanted to reduce some risk, right? I wanted to remediate and deal with rot that was happening underneath the paint. Over the course of this endeavor, I learned a number of lessons, and I'd like to impart some of those lessons to you today. First lesson, and it plays to sort of the lunacy of this project. It's a small world, but I wouldn't want to paint it. It's a big world. It's not that small. We talked about the explosion of data, right? We heard it in a number of presentations. 90% of the world's data was created in the last 2 years. We know that. We have exploding volumes. I put together what I think are the 5 challenges, or as I call them, the V challenges. And there's a couple. Volume, we've talked about, right? We know data is coming into us from all different directions. The velocity of data, the pace at which we're collecting and generating data is astronomical. Visibility is key. We no longer have control of our data. We no longer have visibility to all of these pockets of information. It's very difficult now for us to get our arms around, to see where all of this data is, where it's coming from, where it's stored. We have issues with variations. There are so many variations in data today. We used to deal with dozens of file types. Today we're dealing with hundreds. Rich media is driving huge explosions in the types of information we're creating. And finally, the value, and this is an important point, the value of records and information is changing. We heard in the last segment, for those who were sitting in the zombie presentation, that we have enormous volumes of data coming in. We have this new growing area of analytics, and we don't necessarily know up front what value this information is going to have. It's changed the paradigm for records managers, because no longer it's focused on just records, or we need to redefine what is a record, because we're dealing with this huge volume of big data, and there's insight, there's value in this data, even though, quote unquote, it might not qualify under the official definition of what we used to think of as a record. So a couple of data points. This was a survey done last year by Netscope, and they determined that on average there are about 500 applications running in typical enterprise today. The top applications, and this is rather enlightening. If you look at the top applications in use today in the enterprise, there are a whole bunch of these which are storage related, Google Drive, Amazon Cloud, Dropbox, Box, I'm sure you're in here, just below the top 10. These are posing enormous challenges because of the spread and our ability to provide control around these applications. We have internal locations. I won't go through these, but some of these are far more complex than they appear at the surface, right? We have a big bucket for backup. Well, backup is not just backup. Is it hot site backups? Is it cold site backups? Is it tapes that are being generated on a weekly, monthly basis? What's happening to them? So there are a ton of internal records locations that we have to deal with. How do we get our arms around those? It's a huge challenge. And the cloud. So externally now, more and more of our data is being managed outside of the four walls of the organization. And again, the ability for us to control all of this information is very difficult. Lesson number 2. Paint is cheap. Painting is not. So most of the quotes I got actually for painting my house were in the $15,000 to $20,000 range. This is not a mansion. This is a two-story, 3-bedroom cape. I spent $200 on paint to paint this house. $200. It was a really small percentage of the overall equation. You knew where I was going with this, right? Storage is cheap, right? According to IBM, the cost to manage a petabyte of information is about $4 million. Storage itself, raw storage, may be cheap. The cost to manage this information is anything but. And again, the growth of information, the pace of information, is now outpacing the cost advantages that we're seeing in reduced cost of storage. So what's the impact of not dealing with this, right? We have this growing amount of rot. In addition to the cost play, we have the security issues, right? Are we harboring content that needs to be protected? Are we creating an e-discovery challenge and the expense involved in e-discovery? We could have regulations, we could have requirements that make it very difficult to comply with based on the volumes. And it makes it very difficult for us to reuse, to effectively purpose this information. There was an interesting quote yesterday that somebody used in one of the presentations. If you need to find the needle in the haystack, but you don't know where all the haystacks are, you're never going to find it. So the challenge is, quickly in summary, we've got this disparate storage environment. We've got no ability to control it centrally. We have processes that really are not effective for governing this disparate, this dispersed information. We're seeing challenges because there's an upfront expense involved, right? You can't just do it. There are potentially significant expenses in technology, in people, in process to allow this to take place. There's a very low perceived risk, right? Storage is cheap, let's keep it. And we have this dynamic of retention periods being undefined or being extended because there's potential value in this information, which once upon a time we would just chuck, right? It's transactional data. It doesn't qualify under our traditional definition of a record. So we get rid of it in a short and useful time frame. But today we're finding a need for that. There is, potentially gold buried in these stores of formerly non-records. So let's switch to the opportunities. Right, there's a ton of opportunities for us to improve this, this world in which we're dealing with. So Numbers came out of the CGO summit not too long ago, and the estimate is about 68% of the data in an organization has outlived or exceeded its value, right? The cost or the risk of keeping this information exceeds its value, so should we be keeping it? That's a pretty large percentage of a company's information, 68%. So about 1% of it is on hold at any given time. About 5% is subject to some authority, some regulatory requirement to maintain that data. And about 25% of it has current business value. The rest of it is up for scrutiny. So our opportunities, we can reduce the cost of infrastructure, the total cost of managing this information. Obviously reducing our e-discovery costs. The less stuff we have to go through, the more effective we can be in those processes. Takes fewer people, takes less equipment as we reduce this information. We're reducing inherent harbored litigation risk, and on the flip side, we want to create more value. We want to utilize this information better. So this is real world, just to show cost value. This was a financial institution, and we're looking at a storage infrastructure of in the neighborhood of 800 terabytes. So not quite a petabyte. We took a look at this information and came to the realization, expectation going in, okay, half of this information has outlived its value. Well, let's be conservative. There's some of this information we might repurpose that might ultimately garner some value given analytics. So when we sliced all that out, things that might pose us some value, we ended up with a reduction of 25%. Okay, not a huge number by any stretch, but it translates directly to cost, and these are real numbers. So in what was close to a petabyte, again, about 800 terabyte environment, their cost to manage this environment was about $4 million, which sort of plays out to IBM's estimate. After this process and a reduction of 25% of the harbored content, the vast majority of it being raw, easy to identify, easy to disperse, easy to get rid of, we're showing a return over 10 years of $20 million. That's a real number. That's a big number. Now, it cost them money, right? The initial investment for this particular project was about $2.4 million. So it wasn't free, and there was a lot of groundwork to be done up front, but the returns are significant. What's the best way to reduce the volume within our enterprises? Delete it. Pure and simple. So my next painting lesson, it's all about the prep, right? The actual painting part was easy and really quick. In fact, the painting represented about 2% of the overall project. So we need defensible processes. I know I'm running slow on time, so I'm going to speed up the pace a little bit. There are a whole area where we have to look at processes, and the processes are integrated. So in addition to traditional retention definition, right? How long do we need to keep this stuff, and why? We got to know where it is. We got to know who's managing, who's using it for what? What does the business gain value from? What risk is it posing the organization by retaining or over-retaining? How do we integrate it with our legal hold processes? And how do we now add in the approval processes, the exemption processes? So there's a whole suite of process that needs to be designed before we can really undertake this in a consistent and defensible fashion. The other thing is you can't do it alone. It takes a village, right? Just like in my project, what I came to find out is, I needed a carpenter, and I needed a roofing guy, and I needed a window guy, and I needed the gutter gal. And so there was a whole team that was involved, and it's the same with disposition. IT might pull the trigger, IT might push the button, but IT doesn't know what the business needs the information for. IT doesn't care what the business needs the information for, nor should they. They want to know, how long do I need to keep it? How secure does it need to be? And who needs access to it? The business doesn't necessarily have visibility to the requirements, the regulations, the litigation pressures. So legal has to be involved in the decision-making process. The business needs to be involved in the decision-making process. If there's a compliance group, if there's a privacy group, all of these need to be part of this process development in order to ensure that we're meeting our enterprise requirements. Next lesson. There's a prioritization to tackling this. Not all sides of the house face the front, right? Do you paint the front of the house first, or do you paint the back of the house first? Do you paint the side that needs the paint the most, or the side that has the most visibility? So I would argue, and we've heard in a number of presentations, that you want to look for the wins, you want to publicize, you want to go for a project that's going to demonstrate the value, that's going to show a return, that you're going to be able to leverage and publicize. How do you figure out where to start? Well, again, looking at risk, and we talked about some of these, but what are the volumes we're dealing with? What are the retention periods we're dealing with? What is the analytical value? Talked about that a bunch. Not just now and known, but in the future as analytics continues to grow. Pecking order, we talked about quick wins, and there's some areas where you can look for these quick wins, right? Low-hanging fruit, we've heard low-hanging fruit a number of times. Low-hanging fruit examples absolutely exist. There are pockets of information that really are no-brainers. It's really old. It's in a zombie system that's been decommissioned. It has no bearing. So prioritize your quick wins. Be situationally aware. There are opportunities to implement a disposition program. Systems being decommissioned. Major infrastructure changes. Mergers and acquisitions happening. Large-scale regulatory scrutiny. An example of taking advantage of a situation, if you look at Citibank, Citibank was in deep trouble with the regulators. Citibank was a target. They had lots of issues. They looked at this and said, this is a great example. This is an impetus for us to get our house in order. And Citibank today is actually considered a compliance darling. They have used that to spur development of their program. Next lesson, use the right tool, right? Did you know that Glidden actually has 69 different types of paint? I'm not talking about colors here. There's latex, and there's oil-based, and there's flat, and there's matte, and there's semi-gloss, and there's full gloss, and there's half-calf, double D gloss. And how do you know which is the right blend? There are a host of tools that are applicable to the world of disposition. And some of them may exist in your enterprises today, but not even are not used or not considered for disposition. It's very likely there are e-discovery tools used. E-discovery tools lend themselves very well to being able to go out and identify potential candidates. We have mapping software, aggregation software, disposition processing software, all of the legal hold and legal process management tools. And of course, the traditional records and records management tools. A couple of quick examples, leverage the technology, right? This happens to be a slice from, these are two examples. One is from IBM, Stored IQ. And here's a system that will go out, it'll crawl your file shares, and it'll paint a picture for what's on there. Well, guess what? We have an exchange environment here where 30% of the content in exchange is over 7 years. It's a target. Maybe we should probe more deeply. How do you get going? You got to start. You got to start somewhere. You start small. Get those quick wins. Demonstrate the value of the process. Show your return. Show the improvement in the access to information for your end users. And just begin somewhere. Ultimately, it's a small world and you can paint it. You need a lot of help and you do it one bucket at a time, one wall at a time. Thanks.